Good afternoon. Welcome to another Webinar Wednesday. Thank you for sharing your Wednesday afternoon with us. I'm June Rawl. With me today facilitating our webinar is Debbie Burkholt. Debbie is the Accommodation Manager for Pearson VUE, and we are so happy to have her here with us today. Many of you have reached out to us with questions regarding the subject of GED testing accommodations for your students. Questions like, what are the type of accommodations that can be made for GED students with disabilities? Or even, what is a disability? What is not a disability? Have you ever wondered about technology features or equipment that can be recommended to help our students? Or even about the process that the prospective test taker must take in order to be approved? Well, today we're going to dive deep into these questions and get some insight from the expert Debbie. I'm sure all of you will have questions. Use the Q&A option and ask your questions there. Your microphones are muted. You will all be in listen-only mode. And please note that today's presentation, like all IPDAY webinars, are recorded and archived on the IPDAY website. This webinar is supported with federal funds as appropriated through the Department of Education, Florida Department of Education, Division of Career and Adult Education, for the provision of state leadership and professional development activities. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Debbie, and we're going to get started on our webinar all about accommodations. Debbie?
Thank you, June, and welcome everyone. Through the miracle of technology, I'm coming from Minnesota today, where it is snowing. So I'll just leave that for you. And today our agenda, we're going to talk about assist students in their requests for accommodations. One of the biggest things that we have are requests that are incomplete, and so we're going to look at some of those today, and then there will be time for questions. So let's get started. So first of all, what is an accommodation? An accommodation is the duty to accommodate, which means ensuring that people with disabilities can participate as fully as non-disabled people. Accommodation means making changes to the environment to ensure there is a reduced negative effect because of a person's disability. The goal of an accommodation is to enable equitable participation. And accommodations are a way to balance the diverse needs of individuals with the needs of organizations and businesses in our society. The purpose of an accommodation is to provide candidates with full access to their test. Accommodations, however, are not a guarantee of improved performance or test completion. Test accommodations are individualized and considered on a case-by-case basis. We don't say everybody with ADHD gets this kind of an accommodation. We read all of the paperwork for each candidate and determine what accommodations that person needs to have access to the test. All candidates requesting accommodations must provide appropriate documentation, and we'll talk more about that. So let's look at what is a non-traditional test taker. So these would be people like recent high school dropouts, middle-aged people who never finished high school, non-native English speakers who struggle in the U.S. schools, prisoners, individuals with severe physical or mental disorders. So the question is, are non-traditional test takers disabled? And the answer is, it depends. So a disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And major life activities are things that are central to daily life, such as hearing, seeing, walking, reading, learning, working, and concentrating. Under the ADA, learning as a major life activity in general is a major life activity, but not all learning tasks are major life activities. So for example, spelling, test taking, getting along with one's spouse, handwriting or typing skills, familiarity with the computer, and recall of math facts. Those are, under the ADA, not considered major life activities. And some of these things come into play because we have candidates who say, I haven't had much exposure to the computer, so therefore I want to be able to take the test on paper. Well, for many high-stakes exams, the GED, one of them, the test is on computer. So it's the goal of the then instructor to help the student learn enough skills so that they can take the test on the computer. Again, what is not a disability? ESL, and this is one we get questions on. People will say to us, we have a person who English is not their first language, learning and other cognitive, which includes intellectual disabilities. And so then we have the learning and other cognitive disabilities. Documentation for learning and other cognitive disabilities needs to be within the last 5 years. That being said, if you have documentation that's 6 or 7 years old, please send it in, let my team take a look. Sometimes it's helpful if it's a little bit older than the 5 years to submit that documentation, and then a letter from the teacher, which would be a current observation that the documentation that is 6 or 7 years old, you're still seeing that in the classroom. So just a little tip there, even if it's a little more than 5 years old, send it in. The next category is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This used to be documentation within the last 3 years. When we rewrote our documentation guidelines, we've changed that to also be within the last 5 years. So if you are looking at documentation guidelines that are a little bit older, it will say 3 years for attention deficit, but again, we're changing that to 5 years. So if you have documentation within the last 5 years, send that in. Next category is psychological and psychiatric disorders. And then the last one is physical disorders and chronic health conditions. Generally speaking, those two categories, the documentation needs to be within the last year. And the reason is that those conditions can change rapidly over time. And so we want to have the newest documentation we can see to see how those conditions are impacting the candidate's ability to take this high stakes test currently. Now, there are exceptions to that. If your candidate is blind or your candidate is deaf, those sort of things, your candidate only has one arm and therefore they need extra time to type. Of course, those things, the documentation does not have to be within the last year. But on the other side of that, if the candidate, for example, has a broken arm, we're really optimistic that that arm will be fixed within the 1 year time period that accommodation approvals are valid for. And so if after that year the candidate still needs accommodations, we would just want a new letter from the doctor saying that there was a complication, the candidate still is not able to use that hand to type, and then we would be able to approve that for maybe another 6 months or maybe even another year, depending on what the documentation said. But just know that generally for those, it is 1 year. Okay, next is commonly requested accommodations. We get this question all the time. So what accommodations are available on the test? And I just put some of the general ones here. On the GED test, there are 3 time extensions available: 25% time, 50% time, and 100% time. There really isn't a guideline for who would get what time extension. I will tell you, if you have a candidate who is approved to have a reader or a reader and a scribe being someone who writes the test for them, those almost always are approved for 100% extra time, because it just takes time to communicate those answers to the reader recorder and get them input into the computer. But request the amount of time that you think your candidate needs. Try and get documentation from a certifying professional that supports that. And if we have any questions, we'll get back to you. The next standard or most commonly requested accommodation is stop the clock breaks. This is 30 minutes of testing time. The clock stops, the candidate has a 5-minute break, the computer comes back up, and the test begins again. The other one is 45 minutes of testing with a 10-minute break. Now, it depends again for those what the condition is that your candidate has. If they have IBS, they might need 30 minutes of testing and a 5-minute break to run out quickly. But generally speaking, I would recommend 45 minutes of testing if it's just for general extra breaks, with the 10-minute break, because 5 minutes is not very long. And so after if you get the 30 minutes of testing with a 5-minute break, after 5 minutes, the computer comes back on. And if your student isn't back, they're going to lose time. So, talk with your student, see what they think is the best for those situations. It is not a commonly requested accommodation, but if, for example, a candidate's IBS is very bad and they just need to use the restroom like right this minute, there is also the option of unscheduled breaks. That would be a special request. We can make that happen with medical documentation. So there's lots of options for candidates. You just have to submit the request. If you have questions, you can put those on there, or you can email us. There'll be an email address at the end of the presentation, and discuss your candidates with us, and we'll try and help you through that. Separate room, candidates who have problems focusing can certainly request a separate room. Also, candidates who have a reader and or a scribe, which we also call a recorder, those people would also need a separate room to be able to take the test so that they wouldn't disturb other candidates that are in the testing room. Sometimes candidates have medical equipment that they bring with them, and it makes a little beeping sound. Probably doesn't bother the candidate, but it could bother the person that's testing next to them or a couple down from them. So in those situations, we would put those people in a separate room so that they don't disturb other test takers. And then a reader and or a recorder, which is a scribe. So sometimes candidates have a disabling condition that they can't read on their own, and so a reader would be provided for them. Sometimes candidates have a condition where they can't input their own answers, and that would be a recorder or a scribe. Candidates sometimes have conditions that they need both a reader and a recorder/scribe. So those items are those people, they're assistive personnel. We hire them and send them to the test center, and they work with your candidates. No charge to your candidate or your program. We provide it, and we pay the assistive personnel for all of that. So those are just some of the most commonly requested accommodations. Okay, assistive technology. So there are universal access features on the GED test. They are available to all candidates. They do not require an accommodation request. The first one is adjustable font. The font on the GED test goes up to 20-point font, does not require any prior approval. Just when you sit down to take the test, there's a little tab at the top. You click on that and you can increase the font size. There's a highlighting tool available. So as candidates are reading long passages, if there's certain things they want to make sure they remember, they think that that might be a clue to the answer, they can certainly use the highlighting tool, again, available to all candidates. It's part of the test. And then color contrast. So candidates that might have Irlen syndrome or some other sensitivity, and they do better having maybe a black background with yellow print or some other color choices. There's about 11 different color choices that are available. If you go to the GED Testing Service website and search for color contrast, you will be able to see the different color contrast options that are available. Again, that's available when the candidate sits down to take the test, does not require approval. Then we have adaptive equipment. We have all kinds of equipment here. Some examples are special keyboards and trackball mice, but we have lots of other equipment available. We provide it, we ship it to the testing center, and it's there for the candidate when they come to test. When the candidate is finished, the testing center ships it back to us. Again, no charge to the candidate. JAWS. JAWS is speech reading technology that is available, and we have that also for on the GED test. That's one of our newest things. So the test can be read to the candidate. Do know that candidates who select JAWS do have to have an accommodation request, as they do for the adaptive equipment. The difference with JAWS is that candidates do need to be proficient using JAWS. If you can imagine, JAWS is really developed for candidates who are blind. So if you're blind, using a mouse is really lost on you because you can't see the cursor. And so what JAWS does is build in all kinds of key shortcuts, keyboard shortcuts for the students to use to be able to navigate around the screen. Well, if you are not proficient in how to use those, then JAWS isn't an option for you because you wouldn't know how to move the mouse because it's expecting you to know how to use those shortcut keys. So if someone is proficient using JAWS, it's a great option for them. Then if a candidate needs magnification more than 20-point font, they can request an accommodation to use Zoom text. Zoom text will expand everything that's on the page many, many, many times and make the print as large as the candidate needs it to be able to use to see the text.
Debbie,
Okay,
before we
so
go on
yes.
to Debbie, let's go to the Q&A and answer some of the questions that are in that Q&A before we go on to the review.
Oh, great. Okay, June, thank you so much. Thank you for your questions. So the first question is, what kind of documentation is necessary for the accommodation of a separate room? Oh, there are many, many kinds of reasons that a candidate would need a separate room. For example, a candidate who has severe ADHD and just can't stand the distractions would potentially need a separate room, and they would need documentation from their doctor indicating that they have a history of ADHD and how it impacts their ability to take the high stakes test now. So it's a little bit difficult to say specifically what documentation is necessary for a separate room, but generally documentation from a certifying professional stating that the candidate needs to have a separate room for whatever disabling condition it is. So I hope that helps. Next question is, who is responsible for making the adjustments like color contrast? Good question. The candidate would make those adjustments on the screen before they start taking the test. So it's really simple to do. There's little tabs up at the top of the screen. The candidate would click on that, choose their color contrast option that they want, and it just automatically happens for them. So the candidate would be in control of that. And the next question is, can you show us a screenshot of where the button is to change font and color contrast? I can't do that having this up today, but if you go to gedtestingservice.com, and there are screenshots there in the Q&A section, you'll find it there. If you have any questions, pop me an email. You'll have my email at the end of the time, and I can send that to you. But I don't think I can do that right now. Okay, so the next question is about requesting accommodations. Aren't students supposed to request their own accommodations through the GED portal? How are we an interface for them? Yes, candidates can and should submit the request through the portal, but as a teacher or an advocate, anybody can assist the candidate with submitting that documentation, completing that application online, getting stuff together. Yes, you can help with that. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. And I'll do this last one and then I'm going to move on. Does it make any difference if the student has an IEP or a 504? Well, the first thing I'll say is not every IEP is written equally. So an IEP or a 504 plan might have the documentation that we need in it, but it may not. So I encourage you to look at our documentation guidelines that are on the website, and that will give you some help with that. Okay, so we're going to move on for now, and I'll come back to those later and we'll answer some more. So how we review at GED and Pearson VUE, we have a team of expert reviewers here in Minnesota that reviews all of the requests that come in. We get hundreds of them a month. We then also have external consultants. So if a request is made and we approve, close to 90% approve or partially approve. Actually, I think it's about 95% of the requests that come in. But if your candidate's request is found to be denied, then you can appeal, or your student can appeal that decision. And we send those to our external consultants, and they take a fresh look at it and make an additional determination on the file. We post our documentation guidelines online. We review and consider all documentation provided. We provide written explanations to the test taker about incomplete and denied accommodation requests. So we just don't have a stamp over here that says incomplete, and we stamp it and we send it off. We send a personalized note to the candidate telling them that the request is found incomplete, but here's some things they can do to get additional documentation for the team to look at the request again. And of course, we provide training for the team and our external reviewers on a yearly basis, so we keep current with what's going on in the marketplace. So here's a big one. How can you help your students? There's a couple of things that I think you can help them here. We have a comfort aid list, and it's on our website, and that's listed down here at the bottom, gedtestingservice.com/accommodations. That comfort aid list is a list of items candidates can bring into the testing room that do not require an approval. So for example, if you have a student who injures their back right before they're ready to take a test, and they need to bring a cushion with them to sit on because it would be too difficult for them to sit in a chair long enough to take a module of the test. That cushion is something that's on the comfort aid list. They can bring that in with them, and it does not require approval. So when you have some time, look at the comfort aid list. Those are things, again, that don't need an approval for the candidate to be able to bring them into the testing center. We also, on our website, just as a service, provide a list of lower cost testing clinics. We're aware that testing is really expensive, and if candidates have been out of school for a while, their documentation is often too old and they need updated documentation. So we provide a list of places that we have found that provide lower cost or free testing for candidates, and that is a help to some candidates. Again, we just talked about it a little bit ago. You can assist with the paperwork for your candidates. The big one, encourage students to start the process early. If you get a student that starts with you in September and you know that in January they're going to be ready for at least one module of the GED test, but you're quite certain they're going to need accommodations, in September it's not too soon to start the accommodation process. Generally, it takes less than 30 days for us to make a determination, but if our determination is that it's incomplete and the candidate needs additional documentation, then they're going to get that notification from us. They might need to make an appointment and go back to their doctor, and so you can see how it can stretch out and take a fair amount of time. Do know that the accommodation requests, the approvals are valid for a year from the date that the approval is made. And after that year, generally it's really simple process to extend that for another year. So if your student is approved in September, they start testing in January or February, but they're just having trouble finishing and it becomes September again, not to worry. Just complete the extension request form, send that in, we'll extend it for another year, and the candidate will be good to go. And then again, act as an advocate. You know, it's difficult for these students, and going on the website, we have found candidates have really taken to it, but sometimes they just need encouragement with that. Maybe they might need some help gathering their documentation. They might need help uploading their documentation. Anybody can help with all of those things. There is a place on the online application form where you can add a name as an advocate. And so that then gives us immediate permission to reach out to the teacher or the advocate and talk with them directly if we have any questions. So if you are helping a student, get their permission to add your name as an advocate. So if we have any questions, we can reach out to you as well as the student. Okay, the online request system. So those of you that have been around a while know that we used to have those paper forms. Candidates had to fill them out, gather all their paperwork, and then fax it to us. And then you just waited, and you didn't know, did we receive it, or is it like floating around the earth somewhere, stuck in some, I don't know, some technology glitch someplace. With our new online request system, the candidate applies online, 6 easy steps. The best part is they get immediate feedback, tells them your request has been submitted. Then they know it's there. So once they hit the submit button, they will get an email from us saying, we've received your request. The clock stops at that point. It takes less than 30 days for the candidate to receive a determination from, excuse me, from their request. It's a very secure environment, and candidates used to have to pay if they didn't have access to a fax machine, sometimes $1 or $1.50 a page I was hearing for them to fax. So I'm just so excited that we're able to provide this online system. Now, I know some of you may be in situations where candidates can't use the online system. Um, Paper forms are still available. We've hidden them on the website just because we want to encourage candidates to use the online system if they can. If they can't use it or they just find it overwhelming and you've helped them and it's just not working, we are happy to take the paper forms, and we will forever. So the paper forms are available here. This is the magic key to find them. Um, you know, again, please encourage your students to use the online system if they can, but if not, they're in the how-to guides at this website, so you can find them there. Okay, so let's, maybe before we go on to incomplete documentation, let me see if I can get, oh, if I can get back to the questions here. There they are. Okay. Okay, so the first question is there any practice materials for the candidate to practice the universal access features? Good question. There is not, but if you just pull up a Word document, they can practice them that way. So these are Word features, and you will be able to practice them that way. Next question is, when do IEPs expire? Generally, IEPs are written for a 3-year period. We are looking for current IEPs, but again, the documentation, like for learning disability, would be within the last 5 years. So if an IEP is older, just send it in anyway and let us take a look. Always let us look and we'll get back to you and let you know if we need additional information. Next question, can a deaf student have an interpreter for the test? The test is all in writing. There is nothing on the test that is verbal. It's all written. So if a candidate does need an interpreter to interpret the directions to get into the test center, we have provided those in the past, although the sign-in procedures are even written out so the candidate can read them. But as far as the test itself, generally speaking, a deaf candidate would not be able to have an interpreter for the test. Next question is, how much time does the student have to take the GED tests after an accommodation has been approved? I think we answered that, but again, good to repeat that. The accommodation approval is valid for 1 year, and then after that, the candidate can certainly ask for an extension, which would be for another whole year. Next question says, the biggest difficulty I find is getting a complete response from the physician evaluators. They don't answer all of GED's questions when they provide documentation for the student. Is there a way to make that documentation easier for the physician to complete? Perhaps a fill-in-the-blank form or an outline. Yeah, I appreciate that, and we have looked at that before, but it's really difficult because candidates have so many different disabling conditions. It's difficult to sort of make it some sort of a fill in the blank or a checkbox kind of form. We're really looking for something from the evaluator. And if they don't answer all of the questions, send it in to us anyway and let us take a look. And if we need additional documentation, we'll let you know. So always send it to us and let us look. Okay, so let's move on. Thank you for all the great questions. So let's look at incomplete documentation. You see my friends here, they're at Disney World, and they're enjoying the ride right now, but you see what's coming up ahead. Okay, so the top 10 reasons why a request is incomplete. And the first one has changed somewhat because we don't have the paper forms as much anymore, but when we do have paper forms, we still have this same issue. The request form has not been filled out completely. We need complete information about the candidate, their address, their email address, all of that documentation. We need to know what accommodations the candidate is requesting. Even on the online system, the computer just checks to see that there's an answer, and if the test taker or the advocate says in there, just please provide all of the accommodations you think this candidate will need, well, the computer looks at that as, okay, they've requested an accommodation, but in actuality, they haven't because we don't know what it is they're asking for. Sometimes there's missing pages of documentation when they upload the documentation. So often that will happen if it's two-sided copies. Page 13579 comes through, but pages 2468 don't come. There's little or no supporting documentation with the request. The documentation is outdated, but again, I encourage you to send in what you have. The report from the evaluator is too brief. The test battery administered is incomplete or is inappropriate. The evaluator's report doesn't contain a rationale for the requested accommodations, and the requested accommodation doesn't match the disability. And then the evaluator's credentials are unclear, or the person may be unqualified, and we'll talk about that in a minute here. So just a couple of examples. You see this one, the letter says that this person is a pleasant 32-year-old female with medical problems, including bipolar and learning disability, primarily affecting her reading comprehension. Please consider offering testing accommodations that include increased testing time, frequent breaks, and a private room. It just says she has bipolar disorder and a learning disability, but there's no documentation. So generally with learning disability, we would want a psychoed report that actually shows us IQ and achievement scores that prove her learning disability. There isn't anything here about her bipolar that says how that affects her ability to take a high stakes exam. So this one would be found incomplete. So the next one, this letter is documenting Connie's permanent disability diagnosis of ADHD. This is Connie's family physician. Please provide, again, this is one of these, please provide her all the assistance your facility can to individuals with this diagnosis. Well, we need to know from the doctor how this ADHD impacts Connie's ability to take the high stakes test and what the doctor recommends, because we don't have the ability to see Connie and talk with her and determine what accommodations Connie needs. We're counting on the doctor to let us know that information. So then there's some inappropriate or unclear requests. Candidates ask for an untimed test, which of course just, that's just not possible. Candidate asks for extra time. That one, we can certainly reach out and talk to the candidate and say, well, does 50% sound like a goodly amount? But it's better for you to say, when you help your candidate needs 50% extra time or 100% extra time. Believe it or not, we do have requests for people to take the test like in their living room, or they want their mother to be the proctor. They want to use their brother or someone or their teacher as a reader, and the readers have to be individuals that we hire that are not known to the candidate. And sometimes they want to take the exam on their laptop, and the exams always need to be taken at a GED testing center. So one more incomplete or unclear requests. This one, it's kind of interesting. Extra time, we understand that, and that makes sense if there's documentation for it. But you see here use of a note taker and ability to record class. Well, these are instructional strategies that are taken from an IEP. They're not testing accommodations. So someone was trying to be helpful and they just copied right from an IEP or a 504 plan, but these really are not accommodations that make sense for a high stakes exam. And then sometimes the evaluator is unqualified, and you can take a look at that. So for example, here's a cardiologist, but he's been following Elizabeth for her attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's highly unlikely that a cardiologist is treating someone for attention deficit disorder. So we would reach back out to Elizabeth and say, is there another doctor that's treating you for your ADHD? Because probably your cardiologist is not the person that can give you that diagnosis. And then sometimes, just to show you the outer limits of accommodation requests, sometimes not only will people ask for an untimed test, but they might want 6 times the standard time. And so we'll work with that candidate on a time range that's reasonable for the candidate with their disabling condition. It's surprising how many candidates request waiving a portion of the test. I bet you could guess which portion of the test they most often ask to have waived. If you're saying in your head, must be the math test, you're right. All candidates must take and pass all portions of the math test in order to get the credential. And so waiving a portion of the test is not, it's just not something that can be done. And then sometimes candidates will request testing at home or administer medical care. And we do work with people who need medical care that they can bring a PCA with them to the testing center. Sometimes their condition is so severe the PCA has to sign a non-disclosure agreement and be in the testing center with them. So we deal with those kinds of things all the time. Testing at home is very extreme. We try to find some other alternative to that, but we work directly with the candidates and their advocates to find a solution that will work for them so that they have the ability to take the test. So I'm going to go back to, oh, we're at questions. I'm going to go up here and find questions. Let's see. What other accommodations are available to career technical education students, such as vocational masonry? It would depend what kind of accommodations those students need. I'm assuming this is to work in that classroom, to be in the masonry class. It's possible that they could have some adaptation to using the equipment that they're required to use on the test, or excuse me, in the classroom. Those would be things you would want to work with your voc ed people about. Next question is, what tests can a student anticipate when going to a doctor? So good question. It depends what kind of doctor they're going to. If they're going because they have a learning disability and they need a psycho-ed report done, they would get psychological testing that would be IQ and achievement testing. It would be a battery of tests, often it's several hours long, and the psychologist would give the student this battery of tests, record their answers, and then at the end, the student should expect to get a report written by the doctor that would include the test results and then verbiage or, an actual written report from the doctor about what the doctor saw when they did the test. Next question. Is there ever such a thing as untimed to take the test? No. On all the high stakes tests we do at GED and Pearson VUE, there always is a time limit on the tests. Next question, can I go back to the screen of unqualified candidates? It isn't candidates, it's unqualified reviewers, and I can go back to that. I think I'll have time. If I have time, I can go back to that. And this slideshow will be available to you, so you'll be able to go back and look at that yourself, okay? Physicians are inherently unfamiliar with the tests and the testing environment. Is there a specific location for information on the website that we can refer the physician to so they can better request accommodations for the student? Absolutely. If you go to gedtestingservice.com/accommodations, and if you go down to documentation guidelines, and currently the guidelines that are on there are the guidelines that we haven't put the brand new ones on there yet. They'll be on there soon. But you can print the guidelines. Let's just say your candidate has a learning disability. You can print the learning disability documentation guidelines, and they aren't really written for students. They are written for professionals. And so your student can just take that document with them to the doctor, and it gives them really clear information on what kinds of documentation we're looking for. So again, it's the documentation guidelines, and there's one for each of the categories that we talked about before. So there's one for learning disabilities, which now includes intellectual disabilities. There's one for ADHD, there's one for physical and chronic health, and there's one for psychological psychiatric. So print that form. They're usually three pages maybe. Print that out, give it to your student, have them take that to the doctor with them, and that will inform the doctor what they need, what it is that we're looking for documentation, and hopefully that will help. Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. June, I'm going to turn this back to you.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. Wow, that was just a great webinar. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to answer all our questions and give us all this great information. I just wanted to remind the field that we have some great PD offerings coming your way soon. We're going to be finishing up the GED Social Studies and Science, which will be face-to-face workshops. We're going to be doing some reading workshops around the state, so evidence-based literacy strategies for adult educators. We're going to go back around and do some math trainings, particularly focused on the college and career readiness standards. And we're going to offer some PD specific to those serving in correctional settings. Also look for some e-CASAS, some trainings pertaining to CASAS and the e-test testing environment. And, make sure to look at those grab and goes, lots of e-training, lesson plans, handbooks, and new webinars that are recorded. Remember, you can always access this webinar and all webinars, a copy of it, on the IPDAY website. But before we close today's webinar, we would just like to take one more minute of your time to answer 3 short survey questions. Your feedback is so important to us. So the questions should now appear on your screen. So they're just 3 little short questions. If you could just go ahead and please give us your responses to these questions, we would really appreciate it. We'll give you about a minute to finish this off. Well, thank you again for joining us today. Our next webinar is scheduled for Wednesday, November 8th, and we hope that we'll see you there virtually again. Debbie, on behalf of all of us, you'll see Debbie's contact information on your screen too, but on behalf of all of us, Debbie, thank you again for accommodating us with the webinar all about accommodations. We really appreciate your time.
It was such a pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you.